Hello everyone, today I'm going to show you how to paint a seamless texture and to turn all of these textures into seamless textures. They all have similar issues. None of them are seamless. If we copy this brick texture over, we can see these colors and seams just don't exactly line up. Yeah, so we're going to fix that. And this one, there's some stretching, so we have to fix the aspect ratio. And on this one, clearly this is in perspective and it's at an angle, so I'm going to figure out how to extract that texture from this perspective image. With that information, you can take pretty much any quality image and turn it into a seamless texture. There are other issues with these textures that prevent you from having full control over creating a PBR texture. This is just useful for creating a good base color image. You could apply this. Um, most most PBR textures are going to be built off of your height, variation in color, and having those isolated. And you don't clearly have that here. You have some color variation, and you have some light values and dark values, but these shadows don't directly correspond to the height. For example, this part's deeper here, but this isn't much lighter as it reaches the top. So you would want a nice gradient like you see here with the Voronoi texture right here as it gets dark and then here. So you can clearly extract the height with that. So moving on, let's just start by showing you how to paint a tillable texture in Blender. It's actually pretty simple. You just have to take this plane and then with all these points selected, so with A, and let me actually turn on my screencast keys right here so you can see the keys that I'm pressing. Yeah, so if you press A, and then you scale this out by a factor of 3, you get this texture is repeating on all of these sides. And we're not seeing anything here because there isn't any texture assigned. So let's go ahead and make a texture. I'm going to plug this in here. And we have to click New. I'm going to name it Stone Wall. And yeah, and so now if I go into texture paint mode, with this selected, and we can also check that we're painting on the right channel with Stonewall. I mean, I wouldn't have that problem here because I'm not using multiple textures, but that's always important when you're doing texture painting, so you don't paint onto the wrong image. So notice when I paint here, it repeats over there because it's based on the UV coordinates right here. We can see what the image actually looks like in the image editor right here. Yeah, so now I'm just creating some crazy stones, and if this is dark and light, you could make the darker parts deeper in it, and then you could also control to make like the light parts less reflective, and then you have like a pretty decent PBR stone wall. You don't have the color variation, and that's one cost of using texture painting is there isn't a very clear way to just add just randomness to the colors and control the position. I might do some tutorials in the future trying to sort of bridge that gap, sort of solve some of those issues, but yeah, this is what we have, and we very quickly have this right here. We could press X to switch to the other side of the value that we assigned. You can pick between two values just like you would in Critic, GIMP, or Photoshop. And yeah, we can paint this out. Maybe I made this too long, right? And yeah, and you can use this also to go back and forth and control the edges. So now I make that nice and round again. And yeah, so now we have this seamless texture. That's a really big rock sticking out, and that will show up. So keep that in mind. The more variation you have, the more character it's going to get. But that character is going to keep repeating, and then it might take somebody out of it. And you could maybe hide that with having more variation in the geometry that you're tiling it over or something. But yeah, so that's the very basics of making a seamless texture, is scaling out those UVs. And you'll see here I'm actually going to use the same technique, but I'm going to be using, right here we want to clean up this seam with this texture. And fortunately Blender has a clone brush. And even though, yeah, and so the UV editor right here is pretty much identical in appearance to the image editor. There are slight differences like the tools, but yeah, we're going to change the image editor. And if we switch to paint, you can notice that there's a clone stamp here, but this doesn't actually work in here because it relies on the 3D cursor to decide where it's cloning from. So if you've used any other image editing program like Creative GIMP or Photoshop, the image uses a clone stamp, so you usually control click and it selects that area. And as I said, Blender relies on the 3D cursor to do that. So you can actually only do it in texture paint mode in Blender. So I have this set to texture paint. And if I go over this right here, we can just maybe let's take this brick, and if I control and then click, and I'm using a tablet, so I'm just tapping down on the pen, holding control, and I want to make sure that this brick is lined up right here, otherwise because it's gonna start copying it from there. And I also want to avoid sampling it too many times, because notice it's just well, yeah, it's very faint there the way I did it, but notice it's copying from that center point every time you do it. But yeah, so if I use, let's say this brick in this case, we'll get a seam, we're just cleaning out that seam, and I can keep doing that. Now, just to get through all these and sort of show you the concepts, I might do this a little sloppily. I want to show you, how to clean up the seams I want to show you how to clean up the seams on the top as well. So yeah, so if we look right here, it's very subtle, and we're kind of lucky in this case, but we can just sample from these other brick layers and use that clone stamp tool. And again, you could, if you want, fine tune it with this paintbrush, and you can press S to sample. There's no clicking involved, you just press S, and that's different from most other painting applications. It is kind of nicer, you don't need an extra step of adding that other click like you do in most programs. So I'm just putting that there. I do wonder why the sample functions differently than the control to select that, to position the 3D cursor. It'd be nice if you could just press control and it was there, or just something consistent, go in either direction, right? So yeah, that's how you make that. And so let's talk about the next issue here, is the aspect ratio isn't perfect in this case. And another program, you could use it to crop. Windows has like a default image viewer, and you can edit the images in basic ways. And one of them is cropping. You could do this in plenty of programs. So, why am I showing it to you here? Just so you can use it in Blender. Like, why not? The quickest way to make sure that it's square is probably to UV project, so you have a square, because this mesh is already a square, and it's just projecting from that view, as it says. And if I go to UV and click Pack Islands, we can see this, but it's rotated, and we can actually toggle that off. So in the little menu that comes down here, I click that caret, and then click Rotate. So we have that there. And so we have a nice square there, but even though it's cropped here, this image is still full, so it won't work when we try to paint out the tiles. So I'm going to have to paint out a new texture. So I added a new image texture, and make it a power of 2. It could be 1024. You might actually only need it to be a smaller resolution. It all depends on how many pixels are going to be shown on the screen when you use it. So let's name this stone wall. Now to bake this out, I have to go to my render settings and change this to cycles. And if I scroll down on the same menu, we can go down to bake, and if I use emit, so this is plugged into the surface, and that actually has the same effect as emission shader, because it's similar in that there's no surface information, so it will work the same way with this emit setting. And with this selected, so this is clicked, it has that white outline right there, so that's how you know that. And it will bake this mesh based on what we have in the UV space here. You can see here it's baked out, and I actually made a mistake here, because we actually have to make another UV map so that it wraps to this. And this is part of why it'd be easier to do in another program in the case of cropping. But I'll show you when we apply to this perspective version that this can actually be really helpful for extracting textures. So I'm going to add this UV map right here, and if I use this UV input, put in here, I'm going to make sure that I'm using UV map right here. And I mean, these are the same right now because I just copied it. When you add a new channel, just copies whatever the last one was. But right now we can we want it to wrap to this image. And so with this selected, open the UV menu with the U key, or it's the same menu as if you go up here, and then click reset. And so this, if I copy this input so that now we have two UV maps, we have the one that looks like this. If we look at this orange rectangle, and then we look at this, this part is wrapping to the whole texture, and this one is just wrapping to this texture so that it fills this whole space right here. So UV map, and then UV map 001 will wrap to the whole image. Yeah, and so if I click on this, hopefully this should give us the result that we want. Yeah, so it worked. Yippee. So let's try to apply that. Yeah, now that we have the texture in the right aspect ratio after all of those workarounds, you know, that was probably an extra way of doing that, but that's just to show you if there's a way to do that in Blender, that's how to do it. It'd be great if there were other image editing features in here like cropping, but yeah, we just don't have that. So I'm going to open the paint editor. I'm not really going to be painting in this section, but you know, it's just good practice that when you're texture painting, it makes sense to be using the image editor and not the UV editor. Yeah, so if we go into texture paint and make sure I'm in material view. Right now, I'm using Control-Shift-Click. This is a node wrangler add-on, so I can quickly toggle these. If you don't have that, I mean, you can easily do that. Just to like kind of an extra step, a little extra click right there. So, yeah, okay. So I'm gonna do this real quick because you kind of get the idea of how to do this from the brick. But yeah, so we can just skip here. Yeah, and this is kind of blurry, and that's kind of a danger in here. There's kind of an art to making these seamless. There isn't just like a button that's going to blur them in between. You know, I did kind of some stuff like that that works really well when you have procedural textures because you have more control over the position of cells and stuff. But the coordinate positions, you've more access to that. There's more of a relationship to that with those procedural textures. And yeah, so here I just kind of have to do this workaround. It's just the nature of working with image textures if you ever do that. So if I paint that in, let's just bring it across. That's kind of sloppy. Like you see what works and what doesn't. That repetition, and yeah, and we don't want like obvious repetition. You can see it's a little bit lighter here, so we could sort of try to correct that as well. Maybe insert, you know, something like that, and then with an image texture, you know, if you just focus on those edges and getting those right, I think, you know, you'll avoid a lot of the problems that I'm making here. So yeah, so I'm giving you the right advice. I'm doing a little bit of the wrong thing here, but I think from this you'll know, you know, the right thing to do. So yeah, and let's break this down again, and this is always kind of confusing, so that's part of why I liked doing it twice and in two different cases. So we were cropping the image right over here, and that's all we did with the multiple UVs, but here we're going to extract a single part of this. So I'm going to go ahead and open the UV editor, and yeah, I did that quickly. I do that a lot with a lot of these menus, if you notice, the letters underlined. And that makes it so that you can just quickly select that. The next time you see it, you're like, oh, it's underlined. So next time I'll just, you know, do it that way. You know, after using it over time, I just kind of get used to doing that. But yeah, maybe not the most tutorial-friendly technique. A little fast for some people. So right here, I'm getting this, and we're trying to make these as parallel as possible. Yeah, try to maybe look at intersections, and thing about here is like there isn't a very totally consistent offset. If we look, this is a classic brick pattern, but then it shifts, the offset kind of changes. So you kind of just have to use our best judgment on this particular texture. And yeah, and clearly right here we're getting distortion, and we just have to add more geometry to this. This is always something to keep in mind. If you're wrapping to something that's angled, or if your UVs are angled, you're always going to get distortion like this. So if we keep subdividing this, we're removing as much of that as possible, because these are always going to be angled, but if you slice that up more and more, it's going to flatten out. And we're still getting some waviness if you zoom out. I doubt that this rock is having that effect. But, yeah, I mean, maybe it is. Let's see. If we subdivide it. Okay, I guess it's just a weird rock. So this seems to be enough. I think let's look at the pixel resolution of this. Like, that could inform how much detail you would want for this kind of thing. So, so the width, let's think, the height is, let's say 800 pixels, and this is about half of that in size, let's say. So once we extract it, that's the amount that we're left with, pretty much. So that kind of gives us the judgment that how many pixels do we have across. And we can see that with the analytics down here. If you right-click this and click Scene Statistics, so that's checked, we can see we have 33 verts of 1,089 verts selected. So we can see, so we have 33 verts and we have 400 pixels. And I think that's pretty fair to use that much geometry to even it out. So anyways, let's use this UV map. If I plug this in right here, so right now we only have one UV map, and if I go here and then add another one, we're going to do the same thing. And remember, like I said, we're only really getting 400 pixels of definition with this one. So I'll leave it at 512, a little bit higher than what we're actually getting. That's fine. And cobblestone, and then base color. That's, there's different naming conventions that you can use. Maybe I'll talk about that in another video. Kind of depends on what programs you're using, or where you're working, or how many different things that you're using. But you just make something clear that you know what it's used for. So if we look at this, so now I'm gonna add the UV here, and we can't use the same reset right here because this is actually just going to reset it so that each of these are holding that UV coordinate. It's showing the same thing because this is set to the first UV thing. So if I change that, we see the texture, the original texture is just repeated. That isn't what we want. So what we have to do is use UV project from view and scale to bounds, and it should scale to the size of the image. And yes, so now I'm going to make sure that this UV map's plugged in right here. So I'm going to change that to UV map 001. And with this selected, we're just doing the same steps we did before. So cycles, so this is set to emit, and we click bake. And now we have the seamless texture. There's still some issues with the perspective, and that's just from error on my own, but also maybe some curvature in the perspective. Perspective is curved, and we're approaching it in a linear way when we try to map it to a plane. So there is some issues with warping that still remains there. And there might have been like variations in the height of the brick here, so that might have been where we ended up with this. So be aware of issues with that you might come across with the seamless textures. There isn't more of a solution than just to be aware of that. Or, I could split this up with geometry and then move stuff around and then project that again. I could, sculpt this, use like a grab brush and like, bring this, I did this, I'm not doing this very well, but because I'm just doing it kind of quick, but you can see I can kind of fix that, and then I could go through this same process but kind of going in another direction, where I'm using these original UV coordinates and the original UV coordinates that got me this result, and then projecting it on to a new UV map that would be to a regular plane, and then baking that out. So but that's a lot of talk. You could kind of just all I'm trying to say is that you could figure out a way to sort of fix that warping within the viewport if you know how to bake out these textures like the way that I've shown you. So yeah, if I look at this, and it's using these UV maps, so and we have this texture, so we know it's about what we want right here. I'm gonna sort of undo these sculpting changes. So until I get out edit mode, I'll undo. So if I go into edit mode, we can see that all this geometry is still here, and we can dissolve all that using either the delete key or Control X to bring up this menu, and then click limit dissolve, and that dissolves by the angle, which we can adjust here, but that pretty much gets rid of all the extra geometry that we have on this. And we can see the results comparing this texture. So this is the original texture, and so notice there's this warping, and on the new one, it's baked out, and it has this new flat UV right here. And so, you know, we don't have that corner right there, that distortion that we need to watch for. And now we can go ahead and tile this. So I have this UV selected, and we can see right here that you know, it's wrapping to this. And again, we're just doing what we did from the very beginning, is scaling out the UVs and going into texture paint, and then just cleaning up these seams. And this is pretty subtle, like, so you could kind of be kind of light with it in some places, and just kind of look for similar values or textures that you want in certain places. And yeah, and don't be like me and make sure the brick starts at the right place. So right there, I made a little mistake, so I paint over that. Yeah, and just be very conscious of like where you're putting these new brush strokes, because the more you use, the more blurry and reused the texture is going to get, and you're going to lose some of that sort of naturalness to the texture and definition as well. Yeah, and so you can see I painted out these top bricks, and you can see the difference here, and judge whether or not, you know, this is getting the effect that you want. And yeah, and just you know, paint up here, similar process. I think I'll use the top of this brick and then to sort of clean that difference, and maybe refine, you know, bring back some of this definition that we had here by using similar bricks. And you know, there's this darkness here, so maybe I can paint in this area, and there's plenty of this to work with, or like enough to sort of add the darkness while having that texture. And that's part of what makes the clone stamp really useful. It's just like, you just need to know how to use it. And yeah, so I did half of that, and so you can see non-seamless versus seamless. That looks pretty seamless. Like you might not even have to do the whole thing. You know, if it's at an angle, like people might not even notice. But so yeah, it's definitely a useful tool for creating seamless textures, and you can apply it to a lot of different things. And sometimes it'll work, sometimes maybe you need a different approach. But this is really useful to have right in Blender. And yeah, and I find it a really intuitive way to do it. But yeah, you might do cropping with another simple program. And yeah, so that's all of it. I have this other tutorial that I mentioned where I made all the procedural textures in Blender, like the very basic textures. So like noise, which if you copy this over, it isn't seamless. I talk all about that and how to fix that in another video. I make seamless brick, Voronoi, Musgrave, and yeah, so all that's really helpful, I think. And yeah, and if you want more helpful tips for working in Blender and more about my different workflows, you know, you can subscribe to stay in the loop. And yeah, and I'll be sharing more news and more content that I can share with you. And I have the seamless procedural noise pack on my Gumroad for pay as you want, so you can just try it out and play with it and use it in your own projects without worrying about all the math. But my tutorial is also for that, so you can learn about that too. And I hope you have a great day, and yeah, just make some really cool stuff. So thanks for watching. Bye.